You've already heard enough from me, certainly, David. So we'll just get involved with the comments and the questions. So Michael and then Eric. That's all right.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gavin. Delighted to be here. I was warned that I would be pulled up on stage to make some remarks about observations this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I run a research firm, Zien, and also chair the FS Club. I was the instigator of Long Finance, which is looking at how would we know our financial system is working. I've taken over from Malcolm Hurlston, the chairmanship of the Employee Share Ownership Center. I'm deeply involved with national numeracy, and I'm also an alderman and what's called senior alderman below the aldermanic chair at the City of London Corporation, so likely to be the next Lord Mayor from the 10th of November, subject to election. So there we are. So there's a bit of background there for those of you who are trying to place where I'm coming from on all of this. Do I support Shared Alliance is probably the first question. And the answer is, as somebody who is a researcher and somebody who is looking at when we know our financial system is working, and somebody who believes he has an ethical component somewhere in his soul, of course I do. And I think the comment you made there, Gavin, is research organizations are meant to be collegiate, and collegiate means that you discuss things openly. So I think that this is super. So what observations might I make this morning? Well, I do think one of the things that we really probably ought to be looking at is a little bit more clarity about some of the uses of money. For example, there was a question, I believe, online about gamification. I ran for 15 years a share trading game for free. It was a charity project of my firm's. We did it in conjunction in the last several years with the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. It was called CCX, and it was a trading game to teach basically GCSEs and A-levels how to trade shares. It was very, very interesting. So I've got 15 years of experience of gamification with kids. We do about 20 schools. We do about anywhere from 50 to 100 children in school. So it was really quite a bit of fun. And it was great. What got their attention, though, and got them thinking was the game. And I think in some of the cases we were looking at earlier, what's getting their attention is there's 500 quid in the bank account. And those are all fair. You've got their attention now, but that's not the point. The point wasn't to give them 500 pounds. The point was to get them to think. So I just caution on some of that. There was this JS quote, I believe, from your young lady who said, you know, the whole point was she used the word actually a few times. It's actually there. It's actually got my attention. I can actually do something with it, which I thought was good. I've noticed today, though, a lot of loose and fast on inequality numbers. My doctor's in statistics, so you'd expect me to be a little bit pissed off. But if you're sitting there playing and looking at the top 1%, and you're inferring what the other 99% of the distribution curve is doing, that's sloppy statistics. You should be showing it. That's polemical statistics. You should be showing the full distribution curve and things like that. And I would argue that, you know, you take, for example, Jesus. Jesus said the poor are always with us. Well, Jesus was definitely a government economist or statistician, because the definition of poverty is typically pick a number, a quarter of the average national income. So long as there is inequality, the poor will, by definition, always be with us. You cannot get rid of them. So I think we ought to be a little bit more careful about our use of statistics. And I found today, personally, a little bit too much emphasis on leveling and not enough emphasis on up. And I think that is something I would share with you, and you're very welcome to disagree with. One of the things you might also find interesting is I mentioned the City of London Corporation. And despite my accent, deep into it and its history, and I find over time that most people in this country have no idea what it really is. Okay, it's just short of 14 centuries old. It was founded roughly around 640 with the first elections of the sheriffs. That's the oldest continuous elected post in the world outside of the secular. The Catholic Church, I think, beats us on a couple of other posts, and I won't go into their elections. But we're actually the world's oldest continuous democratic workers' cooperative. That's what the city is. We create wealth in a commonwealth. You have to be economically involved to have the vote. It's only recently that residents were given a vote. You could actually be a very wealthy medieval merchant, and you did not have the vote if you weren't part of a livery, and to be part of a livery you had to be economically productive. The big house didn't get you the vote. Being a citizen did not get you the vote. You actually had to be doing something. And we have always, for centuries, been very much about creating prosperity, improving our environment, and sharing the wealth. We call that commerce, community, charity, and that's what we do. It's a really, really important point here. And that, I think, is a little bit more in the round than some of the stuff I heard today, which is they've got some, and we want to give it to them. And that's not, I'm much more into the up rather than the leveling. There's also a lot of sloppy work on capitalism. I am not a capitalist. I am not. I'm a believer in competitive free markets. That's what I believe in. If you've got a pile of money, that doesn't give you the right to get more money. You've got to take risks with it or do something useful with it. So capitalism is a Marxist word. It was coined by Marx himself, and it's almost as if as a man, women were talking about male chauvinist pigs, and I was wandering around going, yeah, I'm a chauvinist pig, you know. It's bad marketing, and I think it'd be really good to define it. I hate terms like inclusive capitalism, because it shows sloppy thinking, in my opinion. I think you've got another issue here, which I pick out maybe for your research program, which is the concepts of diversification versus concentration. In the Employee Share Ownership Center, one of the theoretical issues we face is as you encourage employees to own more shares in a firm, you're actually flying against economic theory, which is that they should be diversifying. So what's right here? Now, we've seen that in the 401ks, we've seen that in Lehman Brothers, where people have done, but you know, what is the basis here? And if we're teaching children that sticking £500 in an account is a great way to make money, what are we really teaching them? So some interesting problems there as you move further forward. Finally, I would encourage you to examine some wider work. We're here with Keynes. Keynes was famous for having said that the world has far more to learn from Silvio Gesell than it shall ever learn from Marx. Hands up those who know who Silvio Gesell is. Thank you. One, you really ought to go and look at his work. Keynes was an enormous admirer of his work. Gesell was a German economist who went in the late 1800s to Argentina, always a good place to learn how dysfunctional economics works. And he came back determined, rather ironically, or sadly, that Germany should not fall into the same area. And he wrote a treatise in the early 1900s called Freie Wirtschaft, the free economy. And it consisted of three principles: freie Geld, freie Handel, and freie Land. So free land you get, or do you? He meant that all land should be owned in common. And that goes back in a way to the way that we sort of, we're not perfect, but sort of the way the City of London actually works. So you might want to be looking a lot more at things like land value capture, land value tax, and some of those mechanisms. He also spoke about freie Handel, and Gesell meant, in fact, that it was trade, not just of the physical kind, but easy access, trade in labor, etc. He was a real free trade fellow. And we don't have time to explore his freie Geld, his free money concepts, which were about mutual credit systems. But what makes him interesting to me, of course, is that unbeknownst, and I know that because I lived in Switzerland, I admire it far too much, and everybody in Britain explains to me ad nauseum that Switzerland is a very peculiar case of 9 million people. We have nothing to learn from it. But in fact, the Swiss adopted the Freie Wirtschaft outright in 1934, and it has broadly been responsible for their outrageous success as a landlocked nation stuck between aggressive neighbors with no natural resources. I think we've got a lot to learn from Switzerland, but I'll leave it at that. So where do we go from here? Because I'm going on a little bit. I'd leave you with two questions and a suggestion. Firstly, might inequality be a good thing? Well, why should I get out of bed in the morning if it's all going to come to me? Right? So does inequality drive people to strive? Frankly, if you think about it, it's our basic theory of just about everything. It's a basic theory. We were talking earlier about competition. So I would wonder about that. Is inequality a good thing if it's a way to get control of resources into the hands of those best able to make decisions? You know, if you believe that large numbers of people make better decisions than smaller numbers of people, I'd be surprised. But obviously, you're all Brexit supporters. I would then move on to my next point, which is it the case that inequality results from providing returns on an ethical basis? This person took the risk, they deserve those returns. But if you remove that, why would I take the risk in the first place? And we keep going in circles on this. So is inequality potentially a good? We could go on about that, at what level, et cetera, but just take that one. Second thing is I do think you have to do a little bit more work on understanding what is money. In long finance, we define money as a technology communities use to trade debts across space and time. I could go on about that definition, but Tina raised this in her presentation when she spoke about the tension that she has there between these long-term horizons and these short-term outcomes that we're seeking. And in your case, of course, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on time. It's that time distribution that you need to think about and some of those mechanisms. And very finally, don't reinvent the wheel. David, you mentioned medicine. Gavin, you were going on about disintermediation. Everything I heard there, oddly, I would go back to the healthcare sector, and most of your ethical principles I would point you at fall under a category of ethics called principalism. Your disintermediation is almost identical to what they call autonomy. So the four principles are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And you could just pick that up, I believe, almost as is, rather than kind of recreating with various things. You had 5 principles, and they would condense those. So I'll conclude there. Sorry if I went on a wee bit, but those were some of the things. Is inequality necessarily a bad thing? Might it be a good? Spend a bit more time on the definition of what is money, and I would guide you towards principalism as an ethical framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, great. I thought those were great comments, and throughout the whole day, I feel like I've learned a lot from you all, so I think this has been a great experience for me personally. Also, thank you to Gavin for organizing this. So I'll just kind of tell you where I come into this a little bit. So at some level, I too am largely a statistician. So my interest is largely in terms of trying to understand policy evaluation. In terms of thinking about these issues, I think we've probably made the most progress in terms of the Stepladder Plus program, and think about that. I very much value the comments that we've gotten in terms of shares for data, and I think all those comments were very well taken. So I'll mostly just talk about where I think we've probably made the most progress, and that's in terms of the Stepladder Plus program. I'll actually start by a little historical anecdote. So Gavin brought up the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness line. Thomas Jefferson, originally he wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So at some level, I think that really highlights, the founders of the United States, they had this very strong view that people need to be invested in society. I think there's some empirical evidence that suggests that, for example, home ownership, that makes us better citizens. Again, there's lots of issues in terms of how can we identify the causal effect of home ownership or ownership more generally versus just the fact that individuals who own homes are probably more, perhaps more focused, more forward-looking. So this is an important issue in terms of how we're trying to make progress in terms of thinking about Stepladder Plus. So there's actually a very large literature trying to think about issues of financial literacy and ownership and things like that. So we, for example, know from large surveys that individuals do have a hard time making good financial decisions, in part because basic concepts in economics, such as compound interest or the value of diversification, people have a hard time with those sorts of issues. We also know from these large surveys that people who do well in terms of understanding compound interest, for example, that those individuals have much more wealth, even conditioned on lifetime income. So at some level, I think there is some circumstantial evidence suggesting that financial education is important. Now, of course, this comes back to this classic question of are those who have a lot of financial knowledge, are they wealthy because they have the financial knowledge, or was it just individuals selecting into more finance-oriented majors, for example, and those individuals accumulating wealth? So at some level, what we're trying to do is trying to disentangle that. We're still at it, so we're very interested in trying to think about what more can we do. So at some level, I think Gavin has come to us in academia to, for us to prod him about all these issues of how can we more, concretely get evidence of causality, So Tina and I are always kind of bugging you guys of, can't we run randomized controlled trials and things like that? And of course, you come back and you have your views, and that's us trying to figure things out. So in terms of the other thing that I'd say is just more general, I'm very excited about this interaction overall, and that I think as academics, we often do kind of retreat to our ivory tower, but of course, we're very excited about learning more about both practical knowledge as well as getting hold of data. So I think a lot of the great repositories of data are now in private hands, and we're very interested, not just in terms of what this means in terms of inequality, but what can we learn to make for a better society. So again, in terms of me, I'm fundamentally a statistician, and I just like to know what things can be done to make those who, especially are the least well off, at least somewhat better off.
Great, thank you both very, very much. That's it's really helpful. Michael, thank you very much for your thoughts. Really, really. So what I think we ought to do is to open the floor now and invite your comments and your questions to join in as well. And there's been quite a few challenging things said, as we've heard this morning. That's really helpful. This is a stage when we need to be challenged. And Eric, thank you for being so inviting as far as that's concerned. So yeah.
Inequality will always be a bandwidth, and inequality will always be here. It's the extent of the inequality that's the problem now. It's this wealth gap. It's compounding over, it's not just lifetimes, it's compounding over generations. Giving everybody the same opportunities, but only giving some of them financial education to make use of those opportunities is skewed beyond all reason. So inequality in itself will never be solved. It's the bandwidth of it that's colossal now, and that's what needs to be addressed. It's completely off-handed.
Yeah.
And pretending it's not, we all know that if you've been invested over this last bull market has been a good old time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Michael actually, made some absolutely appropriate and challenging remarks on these things about taking the risk and taking the reward and those sort of things. They are fundamentally important. And of course, inequality must be involved, it always has been to a degree. But as you say, the challenge is that it has become endemic to such a degree, as I showed in my opening slides. And it's very skewed across age, across ethnicities and things like that, which are fundamentally important. And for me, one of the things which really drove me is that story from the epilogue of Wind, Sound of Stars, when all those years ago, 50 plus years ago. And what I just tell you about this. I mean, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was walking through a train, a sleeper train, going back over to taking refugees from people who were working on the fields in France back to Poland. And he was in the 4th class compartment, which is really tough. And looking at this, he describes as lumps of clay, his parents, of the little child sitting between them. And he's musing to himself about what that child could be. Given the right circumstances, it could be a Mozart, it could be a wonderful scientist, but actually it's condemned by its environment. And this is what the cycle of deprivation does. And King Joseph was quite right, we have to break that. This is more about people to enable their potential, to achieve their potential, rather than just literally creating equality for the sake of it. And having a ratchet which enables us to do it, and we have the ratchet given to us. It's called the life cycle. I mean, I'm going to die at some point, you're all going to die at some point. But why should that concentrate wealth? It should give opportunity to do so.
Can I come in there, Gavin? Because I like the way you rephrased it, Michael. I mean, isn't equality a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's not a very good question. But I think the way you put it subsequently, the ethical basis for the risk-return equation. People should be rewarded for taking risks, but are the rewards proportionate? How do we understand what that is actually as a foundational proposition for social order? And I think that's a very good way to put it. Because there will always be inequalities, as you said, it's defined statistically, how can it not be so unless you've got a single point?
Yeah.
But that second way you put it, I think, is actually a much more useful question. Often that's a good way to progress.
And I think the point you're raising, which is the quality of outcome, the quality of opportunity element, I fall firmly on the equality of opportunity, but you might find it strange, therefore, I'm with you on the lifetime. I've never quite understood the resistance to inheritance tax. I'm going to be dead as long as my spouse is taking care of it. But of course that bleeds a little bit very quickly. So whilst I'm wealthy, I'm giving really good advantages to my children in all sorts of other ways. So they will still get that inequality even within my life cycle. So.
Does that increase the inequality though? You're being able to give it to your children?
That's what I just said, yes. That's precisely what I'm trying to do.
Do I pass on wealth that I might not need now in order to create wealth?
Correct.
I just simply don't know whether that's good or bad.
But I don't see how you can distinguish between what's the difference between wealth you hand over before you die versus wealth you hand over after. Why one bad and the other good, the other fine? There has to be some consistency there, surely.
Yep.
And we know that the society is very resistant to things, losing things they've already got versus perhaps not getting things that they haven't got. So maybe there's a different strategy in terms of how you get money across to people who might be able to do things with it who don't have access.
Good. Thank you very much for the stimulus of today. Very diversely rich. Thank you. 4 very quick observations. First, capitalism. To me, Michael, capitalism is the opposite of a command-planned economy. So I suspect when you talk about competition and so on, we're talking about the same thing. I'm not quite sure why capitalism is thought to be a bad description of the system we have. And maybe you'd like to come back to that in a minute. I think one of the most important things we need to understand about capitalism is too often we look at it as a snapshot, and too rarely do we look at it as a cinefilm. A healthy capitalism, to me, is a capitalism in which companies are being created, they're growing, they're maturing, they're dying, as was being described earlier, there's some recycling going on with the knowledge and the wealth and so on. And so that life cycle we're talking about human beings is, to me, is a very important aspect of a healthy capitalism. But because of the dynamism of that, I worry about the things that haven't been mentioned at all today. This is my third observation. I don't think we've talked, except very briefly in passing, about how different the world is going to be in 20 or 30 years because of climate change. And I mean, I can't even get my head around how different it's going to be, but I kind of feel that unless the work of this foundation is being planned on the basis that there is some theory about how it's going to be different, then it may not be so relevant. And that brings me to my fourth observation, which would be to say, I found the first part of this morning where you were building on solid, admirable, effective work, very powerful. I found the second part when we were talking about stock very unconvincing, because I don't understand you can research something that hasn't happened and you don't even know how it's going to happen. And so I would, although normally I'm the person in the room being told I'm not focused enough, I'm going to take this opportunity to say that I think there's a danger you might not be focused enough. But thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm like Gavin there that you, I think you are onto something with this stock for data, and it is a bit like you say, it's a sort of a new accommodation with the tech firms. One way is that this is just another grab for taxation and profits, but the other is it's a bit of a recalibration of the power of some of those firms, and we have freely, in this sort of last 10-year period, given lots of our information away for an amazing product. Yes, you could research it, but maybe equally pilot it with something like TikTok, where there are real concerns about a company, the role the government might have. Is this stock related? It's a bit like a sort of souped-up loyalty card that's a bit harder to cash in the points, isn't it? Somebody mentioned that. So you know, is that a way that we can have a new accommodation with some of these firms, bring them into the system, have a bit of a stake in them, a bit of influence in them as well, as just a pot of money. So I think, you know, if you could actually try that out for real rather than, you know, just research it, that would be with a or a Meta or even a small organisation, that could be very interesting.
Very helpful.
Yeah, can I just ask like one question, like which is sort of near and dear to my heart? It's about productivity. So in this country, like productivity growth in the last decades has been pretty abysmal, and I mean, people speculate why that is, but like sort of one accepted theory is that the new technologies, even though they're researched, there are like some firms that are actually very innovative, but like that research doesn't actually dissipate into society or into like the other sectors of the economy. Now, my question is that now on this, in the context of the shared conference, are you kind of planning that they are holding on to that knowledge and finding a way to sort of block other people from taking advantage of the technological research or the new technology, or is it maybe that other sectors of the economy that are too regulated and they're over-regulated? So, for example, right, like planes have really gotten faster since the 60s, right? Or you know, trains aren't really that much better like since the last 100 years. Is it that there's a small sort of group of firms that actually hold on to that advantage, or is it that we have just over-regulated the rest of the economy?
Yeah, I think these are very valid things to bring out, and you know, I think it illustrates why it would be really helpful if we were to be able to actually work with a pilot, you know, operation, and why we had those useful conversations with Meta last year, and I hope the conversations will progress further with TikTok to give us the opportunity to do that.
Actually, if I can add sort of a fun fact to this comment. So I didn't know this until actually just a few weeks ago, but and I'm not sure I understand all the details, but in terms of trying to think about, for example, Meta or Google, how do they actually impact the British productivity numbers? The answer is largely they don't. And so here's an interesting issue about, I think, what makes this most recent kind of set of technological advances coming from data. sort of novel relative to other historical technical innovations, and that is, and this also comes back to all these taxation issues. So when you hit Google, at some level, probably the computer that's being run it's not here in Britain, it's somewhere in California. Who collects the profit off of it? It's some company or some Google subsidiary in Ireland. and so all the revenue is actually calculated in Ireland just for tax reasons. It actually doesn't show up in the British GDP numbers. And so I think at some level this is why, in some sense, data and kind of the economics of data are a little bit different from the economics of historical technological improvements. I think there's also, as Cedar brought up, this issue of whereas once upon a time it was kind of easy for competitors to catch up to kind of the leading firm, for this ChatGPT that has just come out in terms of Google and Microsoft's versions of it. Outside of those companies, it's going to be pretty hard to catch up, and so at some level, I think that is what makes modern technologies at some level a bit different relative to other ones, and why this brings up interesting policy issues. It's not obvious that shares for data are the right one. This is things that we're trying to think about what the options actually are.
If I can come back on that just quickly, on the productivity issues, I think it's Robert Solow who said that the IT turns up everywhere except in the productivity numbers. There's been a lot of discussion about this. McKinsey, I think, sells the same report to about 20 or 25 nations. I think they probably sold it to the UK about 4 or 5 times, and it always contains the same basic 3 things. The first is you need to have a highly skilled workforce. The second is you need to be able to invest. And the third thing is you've got to make the dots connect and put it together. I'd actually add a fourth, which they ignore, though they pick it up when they constantly go on about planning as an issue. I think it's wider than planning. I think it's the speed of adaptation. And the speed of adaptation is hindered when you've got large oligopolies that aren't very interested in change. And Britain is one of the most oligopolistic nations on the planet. It's difficult when you've got regulation that prevents change or dictates on particular ways of doing things that are unnecessary. There are a lot of other things that impede change. So I would say that those are the 4 components of productivity, very much a trained workforce, investment, connecting the dots, and speed of adaptation. But this leads me back, I'm going in kind of reverse order, to stocks for data. I was on the original panel for open banking and resigned. And the reason I resigned was that open banking has gone completely off the rails. I know it's widely praised by all the consultants who make money from it, but I don't. The original concept behind open data was that your data was yours. That was the original bill. That was what Andrew Tyree was seeking. And you would be able to take your data from your bank or insurer or asset manager and hand it to somebody else. The idea behind it was that they would be able to quote and be able to see all of your transactions. So if you said, well, hey Barclays, I want to leave you and I'm going to head over to RBS and I want a mortgage, RBS could know that that was the full set of transactions. Now when you think about it, particularly in financial data, every transaction has 2 parties, and therefore every party should have its own copy of it. So in a sense, you almost have a right to do that. That has become perverted to there you silly little people. We, up here, will move your account from me to you or you to me and all that, and don't you trouble your pretty little head about it. And by the way, it's not really your data anyway, it's ours, you see, and that was there. Now, I would argue stocks for data, if I was looking at the alternative, I gave you one earlier, which is you could go to data trusts. If you genuinely made it open, then suddenly I think much of the problem disappears. Another approach would be to create data markets so that I really had the market for my data and that would evolve. And there's been a lot of work done on data markets. Everybody's frenetic about blockchain, don't get me going. But nevertheless, there are ways that you could pull this off if you wanted to do it. And I personally think much as I give those a very low odds of succeeding, I think their odds of succeeding are larger than yours of arm twisting 5 big firms to give money, which is frankly just going to reek, in my opinion, of extortion. And one of the things about data being free is interesting. I came to Cambridge and set up a business in 1982 up on the Newmarket Road. I didn't set up on the Science Park. There was actually only one firm on the Science Park. It was a firm called LaserScan, and most of the fictions you hear about the original days of the Science Park here are exactly that. Stories made up 10 years later by people who've got an axe to grind. We were doing mapping. It was the first mapping project in the whole world. We were doing the very first digital maps of the world. We brought out the first CD-ROMs in 1984, not produced by Sony or Philips, who were the originators of it. And we made a lot of money. We were a Swiss firm, and we came to Britain for cheap labor, because I could get a Cambridge graduate for 1,700 quid. The university would have nothing to do with us because they didn't like, in those days, people who worked. LaserScan won all the Queen's Awards for laser systems. We won no Queen's Awards, but we beat the absolute out of them, and they went bust. We were waiting for System X. I think we're still waiting for System X, right? You probably don't even remember this. It was the promise that we were going to have the very first IP exchange here in Britain, TCP/IP exchange, which never materialized. So I came here, but at the time, my biggest problem was the Ordnance Survey.
What?
The Ordnance Survey. I'm trying to do maps. No, the Ordnance Survey was going to make money out of the data. It's going to charge people for the data. It's going to charge for the data. And part of the reason we located here was to do with the laws on copyright and crown copyright and all that. But you had, by contrast, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, believe it or not, France with the Institut Géographique National, the US in the Geological Survey. These all gave the data for free. Where's the giant UK mapping firms? I'm missing them. Or the giant UK software firms that rely on maps. Well, they couldn't, because they could never afford to pay the OS to get the data just to try stuff out. So actually, there's an argument that if there's something unique about data, it ought to be freed. And the final thing, Mark, you and I can take the capitalism thing off to one side, but for the audience, I may not have expressed myself appropriately. If you go back to open competitive markets and you think what I'm really after is 1776, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith never mentions capitalism. So if he's our God, and he never talks about capitalism, why do we adopt the antagonist of capitalism 80 years later term for us? And I don't think it defines us properly to say, well, whatever we are, we're not command and control. I think if we're really such a positive force, we ought to have a positive phrase that means what we are, not something that is saying, well, capitalism implies competition. Capitalism implies open markets. A lot of things can imply stuff, and at this point we might as well be talking about Buddhism or Taoism or as our defining creed. So I'm not saying I've got the answer. I say open competitive markets, that's clearly not the right way. Another, we could talk about prosperity economics. You can make up any phrase you like, but I think we ought to be discussing what the evolution of those phrases are. I'd be very disappointed if 30 years from now we were still using the term capitalism to mean, all the stuff that's not command and control. So,
interesting observations there. Great. I'm conscious that it's past 1 o'clock, and we said we would complete there. So unless anyone's got any really burning issues that they haven't bring up just now, I think we should actually draw the formal proceedings to a close. I'd like to say a very, very large thank you to everyone who has taken part, and all of you for coming, and everyone who's watching online too and taking part in that, and thank you for the questions coming on online as well. Really appreciated. This is really just the first, it's just the opening thing for us, this first half-day conference. This program is designed to run a 4-year program. It will build further. We will learn from all the comments made today. We'll take them on board, and hopefully we will mature and actually build it on from here. So please do keep a close watch. The Share Alliance website, sharealliance.org.uk, will within a few days, hopefully have a recording of today as well. And we will use it to keep up to date with progress as we go forward. So I'd like to say a very big thank you to you all, for the speakers, everyone who's come, everyone who's watched. And please do enjoy a nice buffet lunch with games. And then do have a wander around. I don't know if the chapel's open this afternoon, but do pop in if you've got time.
Should be.
And have a little look. And it's such a beautiful place here.
And our thanks to you, Gavin. So thank you.
Thank you.